Kezia, clearly inquiries can take a long time. Can they, in a case like this, be productive?
Yes, they bring a different sense of justice beyond one that's available within the criminal system. And I think it's really important that it's being considered in this particular case. I think it's also good news to hear that the families are being involved in determining the scope of the remit. I think that's really, really important, so that, it could be very easy for the government to announce an inquiry and the scope of that inquiry not reflect anything like what the families actually need from it to deliver. But it all comes down to whether or not people are willing to work with it. And that comes down to whether or not you have the powers to compel witness, powers to compel senior NHS staff to give evidence to it. And it may be that it needs to be put on a statutory footing and be led by a judge completely independent of government for that to happen. The drawback to that, of course, is that then you can't be prescriptive about how long they have to do it. And all of that tells me actually it's the law around public inquiries that needs to change, rather than the families be presented with what feels like a bit of a Hobson's choice around the type of inquiry they're entitled to get.
Yeah, Anthony, that's part of the tension, isn't it? The government have announced this non-statutory inquiry, which can't force witnesses to appear. But if they have a judge overseeing one in a statutory inquiry, I mean, the lessons learnt here might take years to come to fruition.
That is absolutely the concern and the worry, isn't it? Because it could take far too long. I mean, who knows how many hospitals in the country are having similar practices happening in medical centres throughout the country. I think we need to have the lessons as quickly as possible, but also it has to be as comprehensive as possible. I mean, my own study of history shows there's little correlation between the amount of time that an inquiry takes and the value of that inquiry. Often it just seems to take longer and longer. The Chilcot inquiry into the Iraq War, or the Bloody Sunday inquiry, which cost over £200 million, just go on and on. In fact, we need speed. The Times Education Commission just took 1 year to survey the whole of everything from early years up to adult education. Speed matters here greatly, as well as the ability to get everybody talking honestly and fully who needs to be consulted. And then we can have the lessons learned as quickly as possible to avoid this appalling tragedy happening to more people and more families.
Kezia, there's also a question about what sort of rights and protections there should be for people who do try to blow the whistle and say, look, I've got this alarming concern and it needs to be taken seriously. And what it seems like in this case is that didn't happen.
Yes, it's frightening, isn't it? So there has to be protections for people who do whistleblowing within public sector organisations, not least the NHS, but across the board. But I do think the bigger issue here is about how long these inquiries can run for without any checks or balances or even interim reporting. Anthony's right to name a few. I can think of one in Scotland, the Tram inquiry, which has been running for several years now. In fact, I called for the Tram inquiry in Scotland when I first got elected back in 2011, and it still hasn't reported and has costed millions and millions of money to the public purse. And there's nothing that can be done about it, because if it's independently led by a judge, then it's independent of government and no one can tell it what to do. So it's the law here that needs to change, rather than be presented with two options that fall short of people's expectations.
And what kind of law change?
Well, I think if you're going to give families the scope to set a remit for an inquiry like this, surely you could build a timescale into a remit and you get all parties to agree to that at the start. So, for example, you could say, we will do everything we possibly can within 18 months, but beyond that 18-month point, we will draw conclusions. And it may be, and you have to accept from the outset, that we won't get to the bottom of everything. But what we will do is ensure that lessons are learned in a time frame that can be applied to other scenarios. And that's the risk that you run by putting this time frame on it.
We had I'm sure this wouldn't work, but I think it's a really good idea from Tim, who texted in saying, would it not make sense and help ensure a speedier statutory inquiry as possible to appoint the Letby trial judge as chairman? He's familiar with all the detailed facts of the crime, so he'll be able to swiftly move straight to a consideration of the full background of a system which operated at the hospital, compelling witnesses to attend and produce all relevant documents, emails, etc., and which enabled Letby to commit her appalling crimes. I guess the problem here also, Anthony, is that if people lawyer up, like if I was a hospital manager involved in this and there was an inquiry, if it wasn't statutory, I think I wouldn't contribute to it. And if it was statutory, I think I'd lawyer up as much as possible in order to protect myself. And that's the problem, isn't it? If you do it quickly, you won't get all the access. And if you get all the access, you end up with lawyers. And lawyers do two things really well. They take a long time and they spend a lot of money.
Yeah, absolutely right. And neither of those are doing the just thing to the families concerned who've been through torture. And we don't know if there are indeed more families who might have and children who've suffered. And we don't know who else is operating with evil intent, stalking children and other vulnerable people in other places across the country. We need speed and we need comprehensiveness, and we need a commitment to the cause, not to people worrying about their reputations or the sizes of their paychecks. We need actually a commitment and a dedication to public service and getting this job done as quickly and as effectively as possible in the interest of everybody.
Keswick, just finally, we had Robert Francis on, who did the mid-staffs inquiry, and he said there is a problem in that area in the NHS, that managers aren't regulated in the same way as doctors and nurses, point one, and point two. The thing that they care about, managers, are money and reputation. And if you care about money and reputation, you might struggle to deal with genuine whistleblowers. That's the problem that was raised in mid-staffs. It was a problem raised again with Letby. That's nothing to do with the public inquiry that might follow. That's the problem intrinsic in the institution, perhaps.
And how many times do we have to hear that before we do something about it?
Yeah.
So I for me, that's the end of this. Those managers need to be held accountable. There has to be a system for that. I think you're looking to the civil justice for it, and it requires a reform of public inquiry law to do so.
Yeah, interesting. We'll see what happens. And it's clear the government are not fixated on anything, because Gillian Keegan said to Rosie earlier, the options are open.
On the table.
On the table, yeah.